Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this short recording where we'll be looking at the interaction between COVID-19 and the Tax Admin Act. Now, when I look at the Tax Admin Act, various penalties are imposed for non-compliance. The first of which is a fixed amount penalty. So, dependent on your assessed loss or taxable income in the preceding year of assessment, based on the level, you'd have a specific penalty amount. Now, please note that this fixed amount penalty is a monthly penalty for non-compliance, and this typically would be administrative non-compliance and would include not filing a return or filing a return after the due date. So you are still required, even during this time, to be a compliant taxpayer. If you don't file your return or you file it late, you'd be subject to administrative fixed amount penalty for late submission. Right. Now, of course, many taxpayers would unfortunately be subject to this penalty. And then we'd have to ask yourself, how do you request remittance of penalties? And would a taxpayer qualify in these circumstances for remission of penalties? The second penalty that could be imposed is typically for late payment, and that's a percentage-based penalty. It's a 10% penalty of the amount that is due for provisional tax, for VAT, and for employees tax. So if you don't make payment during this time when it is due, you'd be subject to a percentage-based penalty of 10% of the outstanding amount. So how do you then request remittance of these administrative non-compliance penalties? There are 4 categories provided for in the Tax Admin Act to request remittance. The first is if the penalty was imposed for a failure to register. Secondly, if the failure is nominal or a first incidence. Thirdly, if there's exceptional circumstances. And number 4, if the penalty was incorrectly imposed, i.e. there was no reason to impose the penalty. Right, so you have to ask yourself, is this a nominal first incidence? And then we need to unpack what that means. And we need to ask ourselves whether the natural disaster, or the national disaster rather, that we see ourselves in, if that fits the profile of an exceptional circumstance, and whether category 3 could be used as motivation to get the penalty remitted. So what is first incidence? That basically means that in the last 36 months, there's been no penalty for the same or any other type of default, right? And no penalty had been imposed in the last 36 months. Nominal non-compliance in the case of a fixed amount penalty is where the duration is less than 5 days, or percentage-based when the amount does not exceed 2,000 Rand. Right. Then you'd be able to make use of fixed incidence or nominal non-compliance, and you can request remittance. If you don't fit the profile of nominal or first incidence, you then need to look at exceptional circumstances. Could COVID-19 be deemed exceptional circumstances? Now, the Tax Admin Act determines that the exceptional circumstance must have rendered the person, the taxpayer, incapable of complying with the obligation. So the fact that we find ourselves in a natural disaster in a period of lockdown could possibly be deemed exceptional circumstance, and it could have rendered the taxpayer incapable of complying with the obligation. So the onus is on the taxpayer to prove that this is the case. So the Tax Admin Act then lists various factors that should be considered as exceptional circumstances. The first is external factors. Has there been a natural or human-made disaster, a civil disturbance, or a disruption in services? Our opinion is yes, the COVID-19 pandemic and the national lockdown and disaster that we're experiencing at the moment could definitely be deemed a disaster and a disruption in services. Secondly, you could also look at factors personal to the taxpayer, if it's due to serious illness or accident or emotional mental distress. So that's if a sole proprietor, for example, falls ill due to COVID-19. Then you could look to serious financial hardship. So for an individual, if compliance would lead to depriving the person of basic living requirements, and in the case of a business, if there was an immediate danger that the continuity of business operations and the continued employment of the employees would be jeopardized. So there you need to look at cash flow if the business had to close its doors during this period. And then lastly, you look at an act of SARS, so if the non-compliance is connected with SARS's fault or error involving certain types of actions. So the onus is on the taxpayer once again to prove that this exceptional circumstance has rendered the taxpayer incapable of complying with the obligation. And we do believe that there are grounds to prove that this constitutes exceptional circumstances. So what process should then be followed? Remittance of penalties is not done automatically. The taxpayer needs to submit a request for remittance of penalties form, an RFR, that includes a description of the circumstances which prevented the person from complying with the relevant obligation and the supporting documentation and information as required by SARS. If SARS then decides not to remit the penalty, the taxpayer is in the position to object against the decision. A taxpayer can also apply for installment payment arrangements in the case of cash flow problems, and a taxpayer can also apply for compromise of tax debt. So these are all options provided to taxpayers in terms of the Tax Admin Act if the taxpayer is not in a position to settle tax debt. However, taxpayers must still be compliant despite the impact of COVID-19. So you can't use COVID-19 as an excuse for you not to be compliant. You have to be compliant, but you can request remittance of penalties, you can make a payment arrangement, and you can also request compromise of tax debt. So ladies and gentlemen, the moral of the story is business as usual from a tax perspective. Try and maintain your position of being a compliant taxpayer. Submit your returns, make payment if you can, and if you can't, then make arrangements. There are various options available to taxpayers that you can pursue, and we do believe that there are grounds for you to pursue the relief mechanisms provided for in the Tax Admin Act.